sounds like a stupid question.
Probably is, because, yeah, go ahead. Skilled managers equals high morale, which equals all that cool stuff that you cannot pay for and you can't punish for. When you close off that feedback channel, you are not going to be able to hear the truth. In the first microseconds, your brain can't tell the difference between physical danger and what we call social danger.
I'm pissed off at you.
Me, specifically?
Well, just because you're my boss and all.
Employees tend to get promoted until they reach their level of incompetence. Go forward and don't suck.
Good morning, folks, or good afternoon, good evening, good night, whenever you're listening to this podcast episode. Hey, welcome to the Managing with Mind and Heart podcast, where we do our best to help you be a manager rock star, a leadership rock star, and hopefully take away some skills and tools that you get to use in your personal life as well to build relationships and live a good life. Mike, how you doing?
I'm good, Ethan. And that was, I think, one of the best intros yet. I love that connection. Great management, but all the different ways this impacts our lives in general. Fantastic.
Good. Yeah. And I think that's, if I do say so myself, I think that's the cool thing about what we do here is that all of these skills, at least most of them that we work on, not only improve workplaces, but improve people's lives. And in fact, that kind of boils down to our mission at Nash Consulting. We're really out here to improve people's lives. And today, I don't think is any exception to that. Today, we're going to be working through some behaviors, some skills around conflict, around disagreement, which we all know is not just a thing in the workplace. So I want to start off by a little bit of a reflection. And if you want to, go ahead and close your eyes as you listen to this, because I'm going to have you imagine something. Now, of course, a lot of people are listening to podcasts when they're driving. Don't close your eyes. That's bad. That's a bad idea.
Wait, could you be clear about that? So if I'm driving, don't close my eyes?
Yeah, probably don't close your eyes if you're driving. Probably walking either. Just a bad idea. Jogging, in fact, don't close your eyes in probably most cases, unless you're just sitting there.
Okay, well, thanks for making that super clear for our listeners.
Well, you got to be careful, all right? You don't want to get sued out here. Anyways, I digress. Think about this with me. And not only think about this with me, but try to feel this with me. Imagine, conjure up an image or a moment about maybe the last significant conflict you had with somebody, professionally or personally. So imagine that for a moment. And I'm not talking about just, a stranger that you confronted, in the coffee shop because they cut you in line or something like that. I'm not even talking about maybe a minor disagreement such as, hey, where are we going to go for lunch today? I'm talking about a fairly significant conflict with somebody in your life that is important at some level, either a family member, a friend, or someone you work with closely. Picture that situation, picture that conflict, and take a few minutes just to kind of feel that conflict, feel that situation, and maybe try to recall or feel now how it felt to be in conflict. Pay close attention to how you're feeling as you rerun this situation in your head. How does it feel to be in conflict? Right? If you're listening to this, think about that. Like not only what's going on with you cognitively to be in conflict, but like even physically, how does it feel to be in conflict? Now, how about you, Mike / Dad? How does it feel for you when you picture, a conflict that's not just a trivial disagreement, but a fairly significant conflict? How does that feel to you?
Well, in that case, it's interesting because I couldn't help but go to two different situations. One was professional with a client, and one was home with my wife. And in both cases, I think there was a lot of similarities to how it felt. It felt in my body. I mean, what I was feeling is tension, and actually pretty heightened tension. I would say my chest gets tight, get a little bit of that, butterfly feeling in my stomach. physically, my shoulders tend to get a little more tensed up. And then there's that kind of fuzzy headed feeling I get where I get kind of focused in on it. It kind of feels like the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn sort of thing for me, but it's more of a like self-protection maybe feeling of like everything in my body and brain is sort of focused in on, am I going to be okay? That's digging deep there. But I notice when I'm in conflict, it really activates my body and my brain, and becomes kind of the extreme focal point.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people are with you on that. And I think depending on who we are and our experience and our conditioning around conflict, we're going to maybe feel more of that fear response than others. But I really do believe at some level, when there's a fairly intense conflict in our lives, we get that fear response.
Is that true for you as well? Like what is your response in a situation like that?
Oh, I don't have feelings. So no, I mean, definitely. Like, I think we'll get to this. I mean, there's some quote unquote conflicts that don't feel like that big of a deal for me. And
right.
I'm okay with them. And then there's these situations where it's like, we both want different things. And the things we want and the situation at hand in which we're having conflict around isn't really important. And I get that fear response, right? I feel it in my chest and I feel it in my, heart rate increasing. And I think that's normal. We're a social species, right? And so at some level, being a social species, we're engaging in conflict fairly regularly. But that doesn't mean it's easy, right? Because I think we're trying to keep ourselves safe in that conflict at some level, which is why we get that fear response. We generally don't like how conflict feels as humans. Yet, I think the ability to effectively navigate through conflict and even embrace conflict is just crucial to forming really meaningful relationships in our lives, personally and professionally. And I think it's also critical at succeeding at fairly, complex tasks that require some interdependence. And so I think that's where we have a bit of a paradox here. Conflict doesn't feel good, yet it's a normal and natural and even necessary part, I think, of living a meaningful life at some level. So what do we do about all that? That's the big question here. Let me ask you, Mike, why do you think it's important that we embrace conflict or embrace disagreement personally and professionally? Why is being able to engage in conflict and disagreement in a healthy way really a critical adaptive skill to master?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know. I mean, I think that the fact that you're going to want X, I'm going to want Y is such a normal, probably daily part of life. And, the idea that a team of people are going to have different ideas about what the right solution is going to be, or me and my partner are going to have different opinions about, whether we should remodel the kitchen or not, or, all these things, they happen all the time. And so I guess one of the many reasons that this matters that we embrace this is that, we're going to run into it constantly. And so if we're not adept at navigating this stuff, we're going to always be, I don't know, in some state of frustration. I guess I'll just add one more thought to that. We can't get to the good stuff if we stop. You think this and I think that. Okay, so we're stuck, right? We can't do anything now. Or you have a different idea than I do, so we're kind of stuck. If we don't know how to do disagreement well, if we don't know how to conflict well, we just get stuck and we don't get to the good stuff, right? We don't get to the right answers or the best answers. We don't grow in our relationship. Our organization doesn't take the next step. So I think it's a limiting factor if we're not able to do this, or if conflict and disagreement gets us so kind of wrapped up and stuck that we can't move forward. So it's for relationships, it's for organizations. It just makes everything, it kind of greases the engine so we can go forward.
Yeah, I like how you said that. It greases the engine so we can go forward. Because I mean, what's the alternative here? Like if we choose not to engage in conflict amongst each other, right? We just avoid any sort of conflict. We run away from it. Like what could the results of that be, and let's focus in right now on a team, right? A team in the workplace that works closely with each other, that chooses to, for whatever reason, probably out of fear, not engage in conflict. What might that result in on that team?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and again, not engaging in conflict can look like literally not engaging in it, like just don't talk about the thing, or it can look like we don't engage in it in a way that just means we turn to, character attack and we don't even stay on the issue, right? So either way, you don't make any progress. And I think it also breaks relationship, right? You actually damage sort of that fabric of trust and respect in both cases, when you're attacking each other, but also when you're just walking away and not having the conversations about things we really should be talking about. You disengage and you lose trust and you lose respect. And so I think on both levels, both kind of organizationally, structurally, but also personally, relationally, things just either break down or at least don't go forward and grow.
I mean, of course, there's plenty of research at this point on the benefits of teams engaging in conflict. And as we'll get into in a moment here, it's not just the act of engaging in conflict that's good for teams, but it's a certain way in which you engage in conflict, right? But research does indicate that training team members in different conflict resolution skills improves teamwork, improves productivity, improves employee satisfaction. And now, of course, all of that is going to have a positive impact on, an organization's or company's bottom line, if they're a for-profit organization. But also something you said back there, it's just, or at least I think what you were hinting at is when we can engage in conflict in a healthy way and we can navigate through that while staying connected relationally, that improves our lives. It improves people's lives. Right. When team members are able to stay relationally engaged in the midst of conflict, they can walk away feeling respected and empowered, right? Instead of drained and angry. Right. And this, I think if we're talking about in the workplace, if we can walk away from these disagreements and conflicts feeling respected and empowered, and that's regardless of whether or not we get exactly what we want or not, I think this is going to provide people more energy when they leave work. Right. Yeah. More energy to really stay connected with their loved ones outside of work, which I think in turn leads to just more fulfilling life for people. So again, coming back to something I said at the beginning of this, right? We're here to not just improve workplaces, but improve people's lives. And I think this is one of the skills in which we can embed into an organization or a team that can improve people's overall lives.
Agreed.
Coming back to this term we keep using, conflict, and we've used the word disagreement as well. I mean, how do you distinguish between, say, a healthy type of conflict and from destructive conflict? Because to me, it kind of seems like a fine line at times, right? And again, conflict by itself is not necessarily positive, nor is it negative. So how do you distinguish between bad conflict or good conflict, healthy conflict, unhealthy conflict, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I think, I don't know, for me, it kind of helps to maybe define the word a little bit more, almost a little more broadly. I notice I've, spent a fair amount of time with groups and clients talking about conflict, and often people get kind of stuck on the word. You think of, I think for a lot of people, when they hear the word conflict, they actually, what happens to them, what they recall is literally what you kind of had us walk through there at the beginning of this episode. They recall this tension, this stress, this, pretty bad feeling. And so people, when I've been in the past, I've talked about conflict in the workplace, conflict styles. People have been kind of stuck on sort of this one end of the spectrum where it's these, you want X and I want Y, but it really matters to me that you change your mind and I'm not happy with you and I'm going to push you or you're going to run away or we're going to, it turns into some relational thing. I think a lot of people think of conflict only in that context. And it helps, I think, to think about maybe interchanging the words, right? Using both words, disagreeing about ideology, disagreeing about outcomes. It might be on one end of the scale, So if you kind of do a scale line, kind of a, like maybe a 1 through 10 number line, I sometimes imagine on the low end, on the one end, it's just disagreement. You want X and I want Y, and Let's talk about it. That's disagreement. And what we're going to be talking about today, I think, even includes that, like all the way down to that level that most people would probably just refer to as, we disagree, all the way up to a 10, which I think, again, most people would probably call conflict, but the 10 version of it would be the unhealthy version of it for me, which is not just we're in conflict, but you want X and I want Y, and you're a bad person because you think what you think, and we're going to fight and argue, or one of us is going to run away, or, all that unhealthy stuff that might happen. And there's all the different, ranges in between. So I don't know. For me, thinking about the difference between healthy or unhealthy conflict, it kind of helps me to think about maybe the difference between what people would call disagreement versus what other people would call open conflict.
Yeah. No, I do think that's helpful. I think, like you said, if we're just using the word conflict, people have a specific view of that is often intense and really bad, right? And so there's a range here, right? And I like this. Yeah, I mean, you're talking about a spectrum here from there's, good, healthy conflict to bad, destructive conflict. But I also think there's a spectrum of just the nature of the conflict that is separate from whether it is good or bad or unhealthy or healthy, right? The spectrum of, hey, like I said earlier, where are we going to go to lunch today? I want to go to McDonald's. You want to go to Burger King, right? And we have a disagreement about that, right? That's neither good or bad. It's neutral at that level, right? It's how that conflict is or disagreement is handled that makes it healthy or unhealthy, right? But so that's, where we're going to go to lunch. That's at one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum is we have disagreement and conflict about, the way we want to raise our children, for example, right? That's a big thing. Or in the workplace, we have to make potentially some, personnel cuts, right? We have to lay some people off. Who is that going to be? Which department is that going to be from? Right? That could be a big disagreement, a big conflict, and it's emotional. So there's different kinds of ranges here, right? From healthy to unhealthy, as well as more trivial to fairly, important and with outcomes that are really emotional. Right. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think there might be another, maybe, I don't know if there's another spectrum, but it's about the longevity or the how long that disagreement lasts, I think is part of the formula. And it's like here's a situation that I would put in between as far as your seriousness range. Like, this is not the which hamburger do we want, and it's not how are we going to raise our kids, but it's kind of right in the middle. And I'll use one with Christy and my wife and I. So she wants to remodel the kitchen, and I want to build an outbuilding with an extra room. We're not rich and we can't do both. We can do one of those, and we really disagree on that. Like, we both want what we want. If that was a discussion that we talked through, and it took us 10 minutes and we worked through it and we decided, right, we might never call that a conflict. It might not feel that way to us. It might actually feel like, well, we disagreed and we worked it out. On the other hand, we're still not working that out. Like, we're in conflict. It's gone on for a week. That also, I think, at least as far as how people experience it or how they feel about it, has something to do with kind of the impact of that disagreement.
I think that makes sense. I think the punchline here of what we're saying is, look, there's a range with all of these things, right? And for the sake of this conversation, I think let's look at all of that, right? We're looking at kind of the whole range here. But I think what we're inviting people to think about is, hey, we're not just talking about those big conflicts around, values, or like these big decisions that are going to be super emotional for the team or your workplace or your family, right? We're talking about those too, but think about all the other conflicts, to the left of that as well, from are we remodeling the kitchen or not, to how are we going to roll out this performance improvement plan, for example, right? A full range there. So yeah, I invite people to think about the word conflict maybe a little bit more loosely here, to include disagreement, to include debate, right? And I think that's where we're at with this. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think that's great. Yep. You asked earlier about the difference between healthy conflict and destructive conflict. And I guess one more concept on that is, what about people who just refuse to engage in conflict at all, right? I mean, it's not healthy or unhealthy conflict. It's just no conflict. And I know, sometimes that's referred to as artificial harmony. Is that, would you consider that a kind of another version of like unhealthy conflict, just completely avoiding it altogether?
Yeah, good point. I mean, I like how you said that. I hadn't thought of it that specifically as unhealthy conflict, because it's almost like the absence of conflict. But I think you're right. That's an unhealthy way to engage in conflict, I think, for a number of reasons. I mean, take a team, maybe an executive team, maybe just a team that works closely with each other. If they are generally avoidant of conflict, someone says, hey, I think we should do this. This is what we should do. And everybody kind of smiles and nods their head like, sure, let's do that. And in their head, they're thinking, well, that's a stupid idea, right? What does that do over time for the trust on that team? I think it starts to degrade it, right? I think, we smile and nod, but in our head, we're, not going to fully support that decision. When the decision gets implemented and it doesn't go well, we can say, well, you know what? I never thought it was a good idea anyways. And also, I just think that overall, you're not going to come to the sound decisions that you need to come to, right? When people are not willing to speak up, to disagree with each other, to say, I think differently here, then those decisions are just not going to be as good. And I think at the best, that team's going to be mediocre. The worst, they're going to do some damage throughout the organization and to the people they lead.
And why might, like what would cause people to just not speak up, not say their opinion? They actually disagree internally, but they're not going to speak up, and they're going to engage in what we're calling artificial harmony. Why do people do that?
I think at the end of the day, it's a trust thing. I think it's a psychological safety thing. I'm not going to speak up if I don't feel psychologically safe to disagree. And without fully diving into the reasons why people might feel not very psychologically safe to disagree, it's simply, I don't feel comfortable speaking my mind. And because I don't trust these people around me, I don't trust that I'm safe. I don't trust that if I do disagree, that I'm not going to be rejected from this group. So there is a baseline for a team handling conflict in a healthy manner that starts with trust. And I think at the same time, a team has to work through conflict in order to build that trust and that psychological safety. So it kind of toggles back and forth. But I'd be curious to know your thoughts on that as well. Like when you've seen teams that are not really engaging in conflict, there's that artificial harmony. Why is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it. For an individual person, yeah, it comes down to their sense of psychological safety within that group. Now, of course, their sense of psychological safety might be rooted in what's happened in that group in the past, but it might really be rooted in themselves. And we'll get to that when we get to conflict styles, right? They just might not ever feel psychologically safe disagreeing. But I think it really is about psychological safety. And then, of course, at the same time, if you have a group that's engaging in super unhealthy conflict, and there's just a lot of, character assassinations and raised voices and all whatever that is, that also can then degrade the psychological safety as well. And so kind of both ends of the scale lead to at least some statement about psychological safety.
Mm-hmm. By the way, we did an episode on psychological safety that I'll link to the show notes. But that might be the results, or what it would look like if people don't engage in any disagreement, right? Artificial harmony.
Right.
And I think we talked about, if that conflict is destructive, I mean, I think you get many of the same things as if you don't engage in conflict at all, as far as outcomes based. Do you think that obviously we're trying to avoid both the destructive conflict and disagreement and the artificial harmony.
Right.
But where do you see teams tend to slip up on? Is it more on the destructive side or the artificial harmony side?
Wow, that's a really good question. I'm going back right now through my Rolodex of my brain and looking at all the groups I've worked with over the years. And okay, here's what I think. I think most of the time you are actually seeing a split. in the group. That's what I would say most of the time. You are seeing some people, and it's usually because there hasn't been work on this. That group hasn't actually stopped and looked at conflict styles. So all the stuff is happening out of their awareness, or they're experiencing it, but they're not understanding it. And what I'm talking about is you'll have some members of the group who are engaging in sort of destructive responses, destructive conflict. The way they respond, the way they reply, it shuts the group down, or it shuts others down. Then you have other people who are easily shut down, and so they're not speaking up. And so I think if I look over the years, I think that would probably be the most common experience if I'm looking at a group that's struggling, is you have some people on the destructive side and some people on the artificial harmony side together in the same room, which is not working. Occasionally, I would say I've seen a group that is completely artificial harmony. I have seen that a few times. They're just everyone's sort of nodding and smiling. That, though, unfortunately, is usually because the leader is not recognizing their power differential. Actually, everybody else is kind of smiling and nodding and engaging in artificial harmony. And I'll just think of maybe last thing, one time I can think of a group. Well, no, I can think of a couple times where it pretty much seemed to be everybody that was kind of into the destructive, everybody's yelling and screaming at each other. I've seen that just a couple times. And that's why we were called in. It was a circus.
Right. And just to add to that, I mean, one thing that I've seen is a group starts off maybe with the artificial harmony, right? They're a new group, right? They're in that kind of forming stage. Mm-hmm. And it's, hey, like, what are the rules here? How do I fit in? What's okay to say? What's not okay to say, right? There's this feeling out stage when a team forms that's normal. The process out there, forming, storming, norming, performing. It's a little cheesy, but I think it's actually, a fairly good representation of a team's development process. So they're forming, it's artificial harmony. And then they get to the storming stage and it starts to become destructive. And then once it starts becoming destructive, they can't get to the norming stage because they haven't implemented any practices or made intentional commitments to each other. And so it goes then from destructive conflict back to the artificial harmony because everybody's just tired of it, right? And so we're going to quiet down. So that's something I've seen before. I've been part of a team that was like that. So it could go back and forth from artificial to destructive. Either way, that's not what we're aiming for, right?
Yeah, and that was really well put. I love that, using those different stages. When you mentioned the storming, I just picture, again, I've seen it so often, is that they get to that point, which is, the way you said is great. It's healthy, right? You get to that point where we're now going to start showing up and speaking our minds, and the storming comes, which is super normal. There's going to be some tension. And that's when I think people go to their corners. They go to their conflict styles, right? Some people get more loud. Some people shut up. They just kind of retreat to what's sort of comfortable for them. And if they don't work on that and get intentional, like you said, either things fall apart or they just all go back to being ineffective and quiet.
Totally. So where can a team start or an individual start, right? They know they want to get better at engaging in conflict, engaging in debate and disagreement. Where would be a good starting point?
Well, I think it really comes back to knowledge and information. I think we just need to understand. And so in this particular area, when you and I are working with groups or individuals, we just go toward conflict styles. We want people to understand what the 5 general basic conflict styles are. And I think if people get that, they can start to recognize their own style. They can understand other people's styles, and then they can make really great adjustments. So I think it starts with that information. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think information of yourself and of others is the place to start. And that again is so, I think it's 2 parts. So you can give a little bit more grace, understanding, empathy for the way someone else might show up in the face of conflict, right? Their tendencies. And you can also give yourself some grace and empathy for how you tend to engage in conflict. And then once I know how I engage in that at my default mode, I can make some conscious efforts to adjust that a little bit, right? So I can better engage this group. And if everybody in a group is understanding their style, we can all have empathy for each other and we can all make some slight adjustments. And that's how we start getting to that sweet spot where we can just engage and stay connected relationally. But without that information, I think we look at each other like, why does this person do this in conflict? It's so dumb, right? So it starts with information. So let's talk about conflict styles a little bit here. I'll give you kind of a brief explanation of them. You know, the model that we tend to use, or a model I like at least. There's conflict experts and researchers, Kenneth Thomas and Ralph Kilman, basically have an opinion that there are 5 general conflict styles. Now, obviously, you know, there's probably as many conflict styles as there are people, but this is a model. It's meant to simplify something that's pretty complicated, which is what? Human behavior. So with these 5 conflict styles, the idea is we tend towards one of them the most when in a disagreement or a debate with somebody, right? Whether in a group or one-on-one. And so there's these 5 styles. And there are several ways and exercises in which an individual or a group can start to learn and uncover their conflict style. And I have these few processing questions that I'm going to invite our listeners to process right here as you're listening to this podcast that might help you understand these 5 conflict styles. So what do you think? Is it okay if we just kind of go into these processing questions that provide clues into people's style?
Go for it. Yeah.
So as you're thinking about yourself and your relationship with disagreement and conflict that throughout your life, the first thing I think about is just how do you tend to show up to others when you're engaged in a difficult disagreement, especially when you're not exercising much self-control, right? How do you tend to show up in disagreement when you're at your most raw? What behaviors do you tend to engage in? What is your mindset? Is it, for some people, it might be the mindset of, I need to stand up for myself. I need to win. For other people, it could be, I need to withdraw, right? And there's of course a range, but that's kind of the baseline question. What behaviors do you tend to engage in? What is your mindset?
I think another process question that helps people get to their style is kind of think about their experience with conflict and disagreement as they grew up. They're just go back into childhood, into their, family of origin, at school as a child, and it's sports teams, et cetera. And maybe ask yourself some questions around, what did you see in terms of conflict and disagreement? What did you witness? How was conflict handled? Was it violent? I mean, if you want to be extreme about this, was everybody just kind of nodding and smiling and getting along? Did conflict actually get worked out and resolved, or did it lead to a lot of kind of under the surface resentment? How did people show up? I think that the way that we experience conflict around us, including the direct messages we were given about conflict, even if they were sort of subtle, am I bad for disagreeing? Was I punished for having a different opinion? Was I in some ways not psychologically safe to be able to speak up and have a different opinion than my parents had? Were my opinions welcome? Was I asked my opinion even if I disagreed? So I think what we saw about conflict, what we experienced, what we were, quote, taught about conflict based on our experiences, that'll give us some clues as to how we're feeling and showing up around conflict right now.
Yeah. And I think that's the big one right there. And that can often be some serious work, right? That's not often trivial for people to explore, right? Their upbringing, their childhood, and how conflict was modeled to them or not modeled.
In fact, in the workshops, we ask people to really to think about that and process that. And we often put people in pairs or groups of 3 and share. And it's really people develop some pretty powerful insights when they realize that, oh, this is what I experienced. And then you take that one step further and say, okay, based on what you experienced, what do you now believe about conflict? And I don't mean believe with your prefrontal cortex belief, your conscious belief, but what does your body believe about conflict? What do your emotions believe about conflict?
Well, this seems like the perfect opportunity for me to talk about my childhood and how conflict was handled or not handled and dive into that.
Dude, I actually think that we're out of time and we need to be done with this podcast right now.
Yeah. No, but what's interesting, without diving into a bunch of details, this isn't a family therapy session or anything like this, is that, one thing to think about is, if you had two caregivers, and they probably have, or in many cases, they have their own default mode with conflict. So you're often you're taking a piece from both, right? Which is the case in our family, right? I learned through both you and mom, different ways to handle conflict. So It's kind of a mixture of that, of what has now showed up in my adult life, right?
Right.
So good. So yeah, thinking about your experience with conflict growing up in your family, in your community, with coaches, with teachers, with parents, whatever. Another thing to think about here is thinking about just your relationships throughout your life. Were you somebody, and are you somebody that tends to hold on to relationships? Or are you somebody that tends to more quickly or easily be able to let go of a relationship if it seems to not be serving you anymore, or it doesn't feel like it's a mutually beneficial relationship, right? Now, this question, think of it separate from whether or not you've had, strong and good relationships throughout your life, right? Whether you had healthy relationships, even. It's really simply about, where is your default mode when it comes to letting go or holding on to relationships? For me, for example, I have some real good relationships in my life that I have held on to, but I have only some of them because I was a bit more quick to say, hey, this relationship, it doesn't seem to be mutually beneficial anymore, or it feels lopsided. So I was pretty quickly able to let go of some of those relationships, maybe distance myself a bit. And I know other people in my life who they really hold on to relationships for a long time, even if it might not be serving them anymore or it seems lopsided. So it's something to think about. How loosely or tightly have you held on to relationships throughout your life?
Let's pause on that one, because that's profound and it's really important because we're talking about how our tendency to hold on to relationships, and it's really important that we state that there's not a good side to that. There's not a right way to be in that one. And so, your example of, some people are more likely to let go of the relationship that don't serve them, that kind of have run their course. That sounds super healthy. Also, there's something really wonderful about that person, right? That is willing to stay loyal and faithful through thick and thin, right? So there's a real positive on that side too. And I know that as we talk about these different spectrums in this workshop, I have to take a few extra minutes sometimes to help people really get their head around that idea that there's not a good or a bad side to this. It just is what it is. You have your tendency somewhere along a spectrum. And again, think of it as a spectrum, not a, yes or no, but somewhere along again, you can even use a 1 through 10 range spectrum. On one end is the person who lets go super easy, like even before they should, they have a little bit of a conflict, they let go of that relationship. On the other end of the spectrum is those people that hold on and they're in a terrible relationship, but they hold on forever. There's some unhealthy ends here, but all those different places in the middle, right? Where you're going to tend toward one side or the other.
Yeah. Thank you. That is a super important point here. There's no good or bad with these. Mm-hmm. There's benefits to both, as well as maybe some difficulties that could come in your life from both.
Yes.
Right? Good.
That's great. And so that what you just described, Ethan, is one of the two spectrums, process questions that help us really get to the specific 5 conflict styles. And you described what we put on the x-axis on our grid, which is how tight do we hold on to relationships? And we're somewhere along that continuum. We overlay that with the y-axis, which is about goals. It's this idea that we are going to be somewhere along a continuum in terms of how tightly we tend to hold on to our goals versus how easily we maybe let go of what we want. And so this can be looked at a couple different ways. It's on one end of the spectrum would be the person who knows what they want and they hold on to that really tightly. Like they just go for it and they do whatever they need to do to get what they want, to reach their goal. All the way down to the other end of the spectrum is the person who just, with the tiniest bit of opposition might just let go of what they want and what they're shooting for, right? And so there's that whole range. And you're going to find people on the higher end of that range, the person who kind of holds on tighter to their goals are probably going to be people in general throughout their lives that are more goal oriented. They set goals, they work hard toward those goals. There's sort of this future goal in mind. You're going to find people toward the other end of the spectrum who are a little bit more likely to do a little bit more of kind of going with the flow throughout their lives and taking the next open door that they see in front of them. But in any event, it's that idea of how tightly or loosely we hold on to goals. And if you put that together with the x-axis that you described around relationships, you get that grid that helps us narrow in on those conflict styles. Good.
And I just want to point out the same thing with relationships. It's with goals. This is separate from whether or not you've achieved a lot of your goals in life.
Right.
Put that to the side. It's really about how, like you said, how tightly or loosely I'm holding on to goals throughout my life. Have they remained pretty stable? Or I like how you put it, or you're more likely to, hey, a new open door here. Let's walk through this one. Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So,
and like the relationship one, there's not a good or bad end to that either. It goes without saying, but I'll say it, right? Both are great. It depends on kind of what's worked for you in your life.
Mm-hmm. How about you? Where would you put yourself on this continuum? I mean, starting with the relationships, would you lean more towards holding on to them tightly or more loosely throughout your life?
I find that really interesting. I think I've put myself in the wrong place. I mean, I've misidentified where I fall in the past. And I think here's why. Something you said just now helped me with this. This isn't really about, do I have really good, strong, faithful relationships or not? And that was super helpful when you said that. I have put myself in the past on the kind of hold on more tightly, not way on that end, but not in the middle either, because I've gotten that confused with, I really do have a handful of people that I've known forever and we're just great friends and we're super faithful and loyal to each other and do anything for each other. So I think I was confused by that. But in reality, I actually think I'm probably part way up on the other side. I think I am probably more on the side of be willing to let go. And I think I see that now because I have in my different circles in my life, I have known so many people and kind of become friends, actually, probably 1,000 times. That might not even be an exaggeration, maybe a little bit, and I am not friends with all those people anymore. It is actually somewhat easy for me to say to myself, maybe unconsciously, that, yeah, this one's kind of done, or, it's not really worth the time right now. And it's not mean. It's not like I don't like the person or I think there's something wrong with them. I'm just ready to kind of move forward or move on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think that's a really good distinction because, you're somebody that actually, makes friends fairly easy just through who you are. Kind of, you're open, right? You're friendly. This is different from whether or not you can make a lot of friends easily.
Right.
But it's how loosely or strongly you hold on to those relationships then, right?
Yeah.
And so that makes a lot of sense. How about on the goals, the y-axis? How loosely or strongly have you held on to goals throughout your life?
I'm going to sound so complicated, dude, because this also confused me for a couple of reasons. And I think this is clarifying actually for our audience as well. I have also misidentified there before. And here's why. I really have been the person who goes to or who walks through the next open door. So because of that, that's been sort of my, back to behavior styles, my promoter style, kind of take the next thing that comes and go that way. So because that has been the way I've gone through life, I've thought of myself as the person who lets go a little bit more easily as goals. But in my case, I don't think that's actually accurate. I think that in reality, when I look at how I conflict or what I do in disagreements or how tightly I hold on to my opinion when I'm having a conversation with somebody, I'm pretty far up on the hold on to what I want, to kind of hold on to what I think is right or what I want or what I need. So I thought, yeah. So I think I'm higher on the goals spectrum and a little bit lower on the relationship spectrum. How about you? Where would you put yourself on those two? And then after that, we should probably share with each other if we're showing up that way to the other person. If our self-assessment is kind of matching up with the way we're showing up.
On the relationship side of things, it highlights how this is complicated. And this is just a tool to give you some clues. At some level, I've been more quick to let go of relationships that I don't feel like are mutually beneficial or serving me or whatever that may be. And at the same time, I've had a close group of friends that I've had since I was 12 years old, 13 years old, that I still am best friends with today. And that's, a group of, 5 or 6 people. So in a sense, I've held on very tightly to those relationships throughout my life, but it's a lot of the other relationships have come in that I've been able to let go. So, that being said, I would probably put myself, maybe closer to the holding on to relationships more loosely, but not like all the way over there.
Right.
As far as goals go, I would put myself pretty high up on holding on tightly to goals throughout my life. Again, it's separate from whether or not I've achieved all my goals. There's been a lot of goals I've held on tightly that I have not achieved. And I had to let go at some point because it just wasn't going to be achieved anymore. Right. And so, no, once I establish something that I know I want to do, I mean, for one, I think about it pretty deeply before I establish a goal and what I want to do, but I hold on to it tightly.
Wow. So, if you and I are landing in generally the same quadrant. That'll be interesting later to kind of talk about what that means. But let's just maybe take a moment and assess whether we're showing up the way we think we're showing up, right? Or if our self-assessment's matching up with the way at least we're impacting the other person, right? Do you mind if we go there?
Sure. And for clarification, we're now moving beyond thinking about our relationships throughout our life and our goals throughout our life. And now we're applying this to our real-time way in which we show up in conflict. Is that correct?
Yeah. And this will maybe be a prelude into our next episode, but yeah. So what we're getting at with these two kind of processing questions is, if you take the relationship spectrum, the person who's higher on that spectrum is going to be they're going to show up in conflict as more focused on meeting the needs of the others and making sure the other people, feel heard and et cetera.
Or accommodating.
Exactly. That's a good word for that. Person on the lower end of that is going to be a little bit more likely to not focus so much on accommodating the others. Then the goal spectrum, you're going to have someone that's higher on the kind of holding on to goals is going to be more likely to show up as more focused on what they want and not letting go of that, very easily. Person low on that is going to be a little bit more likely to give up on kind of what they want.
And could I just add, you could even visualize this in a way of like, do you tend to hold on to goals more tightly or to relationships more tightly? Just to kind of put one way to think about that. And how does that show up within disagreement with people? Are you more likely to hold on to what you need out of this, your goal in this disagreement, or are you more likely to preserve the relationship? So sorry, I interrupted you, but I wanted to.
No, that's actually right. It's that, and I'm going to reword it a tiny bit. So are you in a conversation, an argument, disagreement, are you more likely to focus on getting what you want, or are you more likely to focus on maintaining the relational piece right there in the relation in the meeting or in the conversation? So yeah, that's exactly right. And so you and I would probably, what we're saying about ourselves is that we are going to be a little bit more likely to focus on getting what we want, and a little less likely to be focusing on maintaining the relational piece. Does that ring true?
Yeah, I don't care about relationships at all. I just want what I want.
Yeah,
I just
hate people.
Yeah, no, of course not at all. But yes, I think that's accurate. I would think for both of us. And we don't totally disregard the relationship because we're not all the way, over to the left of that. But yeah, we have a goal in mind, and we're gonna quote unquote fight for it.
Yeah, that's right. And you and I have done that. And I think that's we're similar in our style. And not everyone in our family of 6 has the same style, which is normal. But you and I tend to share that. And that has both served us, I think, because we really do. We both stand up and get into it and get to the good stuff quite often. And sometimes it's been kind of hard and even hurtful. So I think there, like you said earlier, there's positive and negative to each of these styles.
Yeah. And just maybe a little bit of a preview for our next episode. I mean, you can start to see how these different dynamics would interact with each other. If somebody tends to hold on to the goal pretty strongly throughout a disagreement, and someone tends to really just want to preserve the relationship and hold on to that, well, without an awareness of each other's styles, you can see how that could cause some relational issues throughout time, right? Because one person is holding on to the goal and one person is willing to let go of the goal. Over time, now I'm a little bit resentful because I never get what I want, right? I never get my needs met. And so there's these different styles, of course, are going to interact in different ways. And again, it comes back to some awareness.
Yeah, that's great. Next episode, let's dig in.
By the way, folks, in the show notes, I'm going to link to our blog post that we did on this very topic, conflict styles. I really, really encourage you to look at this blog post. It's short, but it will show the actual grid there. It's really hard to explain the grid, of course, over audio here, but that will show you the 5 different conflict styles that we're going to dig into next episode. But it shows you that the XY axis, with the X axis being low to high relationship and holding on to relationship, and the Y axis being low to high holding on to goals. So it's going to make a lot more sense if you read that blog post. And again, I encourage you to do that before you listen to the next episode if you can. And I think you'll get the most out of it. Any parting words for our dear listeners here, Mr. Nash?
No, other than I am just so geared up to keep talking about this. I hope people will tune in next time.
Beautiful. By the way, shameless advertisement here. We have a monthly or mostly monthly newsletter. And this is the newsletter where we shared this piece we wrote on conflict styles. We share a lot of different management skills and behaviors to start working on and practicing, management tips, just helping you thrive in the workplace, leading others, and thrive in life. So if you'd like to get on to that newsletter, it's easy to sign up. It's easy to get off it if you don't like it. You can get on that newsletter by texting the word leading to the number 66866. Leading to 66866. Sign up. I think you'll like it. Besides that, folks, tune in next episode for more on conflict styles. Bye now.